Apartheid in South Africa was rightly condemned by the world, a brutal system of segregation built on race and injustice. But what if I told you that a similar system still exists today, one that's affected hundreds of millions more people but remains under the radar, quiet, bureaucratic, invisible? It's called the Hukou system, which literally means residence registration, and it's China's internal apartheid, worse in scale, longer in duration, and still going on. In China, where you're born decides how you live, not because of your family, not because of your talent, but because of your Hukou, your household registration. There are two types, urban Hukou and rural Hukou. Urban Hukou holders enjoy better schools, better hospitals, job opportunities, pensions and protections. Rural Hukou holders, they build the cities, clean the streets, raise the children of the rich, but they are treated like second-class citizens, denied public education for their own kids, denied access to healthcare, denied dignity. And when they migrate to cities to work, they're still treated as outsiders in their own country, just because their Hukou is rural. This isn't migration, it's institutionalized exclusion. The apartheid system and the Chinese Hukou system, though distinct in their historical and cultural context, share some parallels in terms of segregation, inequality, and the control of movement between different groups of people. The comparison can focus on the effects of urban versus rural segregation in both systems. Apartheid in South Africa, the apartheid system, which lasted from 1948 to 1994, was a state-sanctioned system of racial segregation. Black South Africans were legally restricted from living in certain areas, using certain services, and accessing quality education and healthcare. They were forced into designated areas called homelands or Bantustan, separate from white South Africans, and their rights to vote, move freely, or live in urban areas were severely restricted. Hukou system in China. The Hukou system, established in the 1950s, classifies citizens into two categories, urban and rural. This system restricts the movement of rural people into cities by controlling access to benefits such as education, healthcare, and housing in urban areas. A person's Hukou, or household registration, is tied to their place of origin, which determines where they can legally live, work, and access social services. There is a significant gap between the treatment of those with urban Hukou, city residents, and rural Hukou, those living in the countryside, creating a form of inequality. Apartheid. Under apartheid, black South Africans were required to carry passbooks that restricted their movement. They were not allowed to live in cities or towns without special permission, and their right to move was restricted to certain areas or homelands. This led to forced removals and the establishment of racially segregated spaces, with non-white people prohibited from living in most urban centers unless they were working there in specific roles. Hukou system. While the Hukou system doesn't require a passbook in the same way, it restricts internal migration by controlling access to urban benefits. Rural residents who move to cities in search of better opportunities are considered migrants and often face difficulties in securing jobs, housing, and healthcare in urban areas. This restricts their ability to integrate into city life fully, and they are often relegated to low-paying, informal jobs, perpetuating a cycle of poverty. Economic inequality was one of the major outcomes of apartheid. The system entrenched a racially based division of labor, with white South Africans holding the majority of economic power and wealth. Black South Africans were largely confined to menial labor roles, had limited access to education, and were systematically denied the opportunity to advance economically or socially. Similarly, the Hukou system creates a stark divide between urban and rural residents, which translates into significant economic disparities. Urban residents have access to better education, healthcare, and employment opportunities, while rural residents, who make up a significant portion of the population, are often stuck in low-paying agricultural jobs with limited social mobility. The gap between urban and rural income levels has been one of the most persistent issues in China, with urban residents enjoying a much higher standard of living. Education and healthcare were racially segregated under apartheid. Black South Africans were given substandard education and healthcare, while white South Africans had access to world-class services. This disparity was a key component of the system's aim to maintain white dominance over the majority population. A similar divide exists under the Hukou system. Urban residents have access to better education, healthcare, and social services, while rural residents are often forced to rely on lower quality services in their home regions. Rural children face significant barriers to accessing urban education, and rural migrants in cities typically lack access to public health care or social security benefits, which are tied to their Hukou status. Apartheid had a profound psychological impact on both the oppressed and the oppressors. For Black South Africans, it reinforced feelings of inferiority and limited their opportunities to participate fully in society. White South Africans were socialized to believe in their superiority, further entrenching systemic racism. The Hukou system has also led to a sense of stratification and inequality within Chinese society. Rural residents may feel marginalized or second-class due to their Hukou status, and the idea of being a migrant worker in urban areas has become stigmatized. For urban residents, the gap between rural and urban life can foster a sense of superiority and entitlement to better services and opportunities. The end of apartheid brought significant reforms, including the establishment of a democratic government in 1994. However, the legacy of apartheid still lingers in South Africa, with racial inequality and poverty continuing to impact many Black South Africans. While political rights have been granted, economic inequality remains a major challenge. In China, there have been calls for reforming the Hukou system to allow for greater mobility and equality between rural and urban populations. Some reforms have been made in recent years, allowing rural migrants in certain cities to access urban benefits. However, significant gaps remain, and the system still functions as a barrier to full integration of rural residents into urban society. Apartheid was explicitly racial and codified in law in a way that made it stark, undeniable, and morally repugnant to much of the world. The system was challenged by a powerful global movement. International sanctions, cultural boycotts, and vocal condemnation from NGOs, governments, and civil society made apartheid a well-known evil. Its visual impact, whites-only signs, passbook arrests, forced removals, made it impossible to ignore. The Hukou system, by contrast, is bureaucratic and largely administrative. There are no signs saying rural people not allowed, but the restrictions are deeply embedded in policy, often in housing, school enrollment rules, or healthcare eligibility. The inequality it creates is normalized in Chinese society. Many Chinese citizens, especially urban dwellers, see the system as just a part of life or even a necessary control mechanism. Internationally, the Hukou system flies under the radar. It doesn't fit easily into Western media narratives of overt oppression, and because it's based on urban-rural classification rather than race, it can be dismissed or misunderstood as a development issue rather than a systemic injustice. But it's not just rural versus urban. Even among cities, your Hukou determines your status. A Beijing Hukou or Shanghai Hukou is like holding a VIP pass. It gives access to elite schools, top-tier hospitals, property rights, and business advantages. People go through sham marriages, pay bribes, or join talent programs just to obtain one. Meanwhile, people living in the same cities, sometimes for decades, cannot register their kids in school, cannot buy homes, cannot retire with benefits. This is feudalism digitized, a caste system hiding behind modern development. Initially, the divide was binary, urban versus rural, but today the system has morphed into a tiered hierarchy, where Beijing, Shanghai and Shenzhen Hukou equal elite citizenship. Second and third tier city Hukou mean mid-level status. Rural Hukou, even in peri-urban areas, is at the bottom rung. A Shanghai Hukou, for example, grants access to top-tier public education, premium healthcare systems, property ownership privileges and pensions and unemployment benefits far exceeding those in rural regions. In other words, Hukou has become a form of regionalized wealth, creating localized aristocracies based on one's birth registration and not merit, labor or contribution. Urban Hukous in prosperous cities are so valuable that people pay bribes or enter sham marriages to get one. Local governments use them as carrots to attract skilled talent. Companies and bureaucrats abuse Hukou allocation as a form of corruption or patronage. It becomes a transactional good. Want a school spot? Get local Hukou. Want to start a business with favorable tax terms? Get local Hukou. Want to buy property in a desirable neighborhood? Must have that city's Hukou. Local officials can selectively grant or deny Hukou transfers, creating space for bribes, favoritism and power abuse. Police systems and social service departments are the gatekeepers of this resource and often operate opaquely. In some cases, wealthy individuals can purchase a city Hukou through talent schemes, while poor but hard-working migrants, often with decades of residency, are denied the same privilege. Wealthy cities reap the labor benefits of migrant workers, like those in construction, sanitation and delivery, without bearing the social cost. They don't provide education or healthcare to the workers' families. This is essentially a colonial dynamic, where cities extract labor while exporting suffering back to the countryside. As of 2024, over 35% of China's total population still holds rural Hukou. That's hundreds of millions of people, largely marginalized. Even urbanized rural areas remain locked in a system where schools are underfunded, infrastructure is poor and development lags behind, not because of geographic inevitability but due to systematic exclusion. Those born into rural Hukou face lifelong hurdles: worse medical care, worse job prospects, limited higher education opportunities, and no say in the cities they help build. But perhaps worst of all is the psychological damage. If you have a rural Hukou, you are looked down upon. You're called Nong Min Gong, a slur for peasant laborers. You face bullying in schools, bias in hiring, even rejection in marriage. You learn from birth that you're not good enough. This discrimination is learned, institutionalized, and most tragically, accepted. And who benefits from this? The Chinese Communist Party. By dividing the people by birthplace, by conditioning them to feel inferior or superior, the CCP makes sure the people never unite, never ask for equal rights, never challenge the system, divide and rule not by race, but by registration. Beyond the material disadvantages, rural Hukou holders often face open prejudice from urban residents. The term Nong Min Gong is often used derogatorily. Job discrimination is also rampant, with employers openly preferring urban Hukou holders. In the marriage market, families of urban residents may reject rural suitors. Even in schools, children with rural Hukou are mocked as hillbillies, even if they grow up in urban peripheries. This isn't just policy discrimination, it's cultural discrimination, socially reproduced at every level. And from a young age, individuals internalize a geographic caste identity. A rural Hukou becomes a kind of branded inferiority, not unlike untouchability in caste systems. Migrant workers in cities are trained to stay invisible to avoid causing trouble, as they know they are not entitled to full rights. Even in social relationships, many hide their Hukou status to avoid being looked down upon. This breeds social atomization, no sense of belonging, no collective solidarity, no expectation of fairness, just personal survival, often at the expense of others. The CCP's maintenance of the Hukou system isn't just about economic control, it's a psychological strategy to prevent national unity. People from different regions don't trust each other. People with rural Hukou don't identify with urban residents, and vice versa. A society where no one sees others as equals is much easier to govern and manipulate. At its core, Hukou eliminates the idea of a shared citizenship. People don't feel they have equal stake in their country. There is no universal right to education, healthcare, or mobility. You are not a citizen. You are a registered subject whose life path is dictated by birth location. This is antithetical to modern civic values and stands in sharp contrast to the equality promised in China's constitution. Most Chinese, especially urbanites, accept it as natural because they've grown up with it. The CCP never calls it what it is, an apartheid-style internal passport system. There's no international media pressure. The suffering is silent, bureaucratic, and rarely bloody. The world condemned apartheid, but Hukou apartheid still goes unnoticed, not because it's less harmful, but because it's more subtle. It hides in spreadsheets, in school policies, in urban planning, but its victims? They number in the hundreds of millions, and they still suffer every day. It's time we call it what it is, a crime against equality, a system designed to divide, control, and suppress, and it must end.